Dit is Dinsdag die 13de Februarie. Goeienaand, ons gaan aan met Destiny. The powerful 6 binoculars pulled the Cuban convoy in close, and as it rolled past, Sergeant Jeffrey Bird whistled softly. T-64s, he whispered to Snake Basson. 25 of them. This must mean something. Look at all the Urals, heavily loaded. Snake took the binoculars from Jeffrey, heavily guarded too. As soon as the convoy disappeared from observation, Jeffrey opened his rucksack and finished out the handheld electronic data transmitter, or DET, as it was generally known. Pushing his spectacles back on his nose, he started typing the message into the DET. Their position was high up a rock kopje that overlooked the Shibemba-Kahama road from a distance of more or less a mile and a half. Well concealed between couples of enormous boulders, they had an excellent view of the valley stretched away from the kopje towards the road. A mattress of mupani trees lay below them, leaving them almost undetectable from ground observation. They had entered this height 3 days earlier, during the night, while taking the utmost care not to leave any signs of their presence or approach. They never left the height except to answer to nature's call, and that only happened just around the boulder, still very much out of sight. Jeffrey was lying on his side, working on the message with Snake still scanning the valley below for any signs of life. Lying flat on his stomach, his camouflaged uniform, dusty and dirty with 14 days wearing. He sighed. What a job. Yeah, Jeffrey chuckled. Just think of the boys at home, all tanned, full of beer and girls crawling over them. And here I am, with you as my companion. Remember that girl? The one in the tropics, the one that old Ben was after? Hell, her legs were as long as eternity. If I could get my hands on her now. Claws, you mean? Snake glanced at his hands. They were as dirty as a pig in mud. He noticed some white skin visible. The camouflage is coming off, he grunted and rolled to his side, producing a little flask of camouflage cream which he viciously spread on his face, hands and arms. You need some too. What's the time? 3:50, almost time for the sked. Jeffrey connected the DET with the Sinkel 30 high frequency radio and put the required frequency and hopper mode in. At a predefined time, the master station at the HQ would synchronize and by doing so, pull the substations. The DET would send the message in a matter of seconds through the whole series of different frequencies, making it impossible for the enemy to detect and find direction. At exactly 4 o'clock, they heard the familiar series of bleeps. Got this, Jeffrey grunted and pressed the send button on the DET. There was no return message, except confirmation of message received. Jeffrey turned off the set and reassembled everything back into his rucksack. That settled it, he told Snake. Tonight, we have to shift position. 15 kilometers to the south, Tom McLaughlin sat huddled on one knee, his AK-47 ready. He was completely still, not a muscle twitching, as his eyes searched the bush in front of him. But he could detect nothing, and his eyes floated back to the waterhole, where it reverted on the piece of white paper nailed to a tree trunk near the wooden water through. He was uneasy about it. It didn't belong there. It was out of place. He knew it was some kind of message. But if it was a message, then someone must have known they were working the area. The person also knew that they would need water, and a waterhole was the perfect place for an ambush. The problem usually was to pinpoint a waterhole and to lay an area ambush to cover the large area. One needed a lot of men. Perhaps this was a shot in the dark. He glanced sideways at Lieutenant John Van Zyl, a new addition to his group. He had to look twice before noticing him some 20 yards to his right. John grinned and showed a thumbs up. Tom still didn't move. 20 more minutes passed slowly before Tom moved. It was almost dark now, and moving from cover to cover, he approached the water hole. Everything was quiet, and he knew John was circling the hole on the far side. Tom sank to the ground near the hole and shrugged off his heavy backpack. Moments later, John came up to him and discarded his gear. "Nothing," he whispered, and with a nod, Tom went for a closer inspection. The hole was deep and dark, dug by the local population. A system of crudely made steps led down into the hole about 50 meters deep. As John descended with his water bottles down to the hole using a penlight torch, Tom took the paper down, and in the fast-fading light of the dying day, he read the message written in an immaculate handwriting. "We know you are here, and we will find you. This water hole has been poisoned. Everyone who drinks from it will surely die. Mamba." Tom stood still. Poison! Mamba! He felt a chill spreading through him, a coldness he seldom experienced, only in extreme danger. It spread over him. Mamba was here, and he's alive. Impossible! He remembered that late afternoon when he had lured Mamba and his team into an ambush so well executed that none had escaped, except Mamba. The blood spoor they followed the next morning had shown there could be no escape. Yet they had lost his track after heavy rainfall and thought he had died. The poison. He quickly searched the area around the hole, but there's no traces of any dead animals or birds. Maybe a ploy? No person in his right mind would poison a water hole. The local population, all animals and both sides' soldiers were using the water. It would be madness and suicidal to poison a water hole. Now what then? Never during this bush war had anyone poisoned water. The idea was unthinkable. Perhaps Mamba wanted to scare them, force them to abandon their mission. Mamba wanted them out of the area. His type would never poison a water hole. He was too intelligent and far-sighted to do that. After all, they have to use the water too. He let John fill his own bottles as well while he stood guard. The note was interesting. He was the first to use this method to throw pursuers off guard, leaving a message to warn the pursuer there were anti-personnel mines. It slowed them while they searched for it, and obviously they could find nothing. The next note made him search again. With the third note, they reasoned this as a ploy, and this time there was a mine. And by doing that, he had always maintained the initiative and advantage over whoever might be on his tracks. And now Mamba had left a note. Tom wanted a smoke badly, but it was forbidden to smoke after dark. He knew that somehow he had to regain the initiative, so he scribbled a message on Mamba's note as the best he could in the darkness, using his own combat name. I urinated in the water. Tango Mike. Speaking in a whisper, he told John what he was planning to do, and they set out for the next waterhole. They walked with the stars, and every once in a while he checked his compass. The nearest waterhole was 9 miles north, and they reached it after midnight. After a quick scout, Tom moved in and discovered another note. At that moment he knew for certain that the story of the poison was a ploy. He left his own message and pinned it in a different position. They reached the third hole close to dawn and he followed the same procedure. It was light when they finally crawled into a thick patch of bush to sleep. Mamba had set out his temporary base camp high up in the mountains. From his position he could clearly see the beacon, which was the rendezvous for his unit. Below their position, the earth fell away, giving him a clear view of the terrain to the north, where his men were still patrolling the thick bush. Stone koppies stood out from the flat earth in an amazing pattern. It was as if someone had dumped heaps of rocks with huge wheelbarrows. And in these stone koppies one could find numerous caves and tunnels. It provided the perfect observation posts. It was in some of these koppies that the small Boers teams would be hiding. With a decisive sigh, he got up from the rock and walked back through the thick mupani trees to where a small fire was burning next to the rock overhang. He felt good. It was good to be back in the bush. He grinned as the two men at the fire looked up. "What's in the pot?" he asked, and sank to the ground. "We called a pheasant this morning." Alfonso replied, "Rice and some wild garlic. Our supplies are running low." Mamba grunted. "You can go to the locals south of here. See what you can find tomorrow." "Find us a nice fat goat," the third man called Simon interjected. "Both of you can go," Mamba said. "The rest of the men will be here tomorrow evening. We can cook a good meal for them." They started early the next morning, working their way down the valley. Once on the plain, they walked faster. They knew the Boers were somewhere north, so they didn't bother too much about cover, and they made good time. They found 2 deserted kraals, and a third where only an old man and his daughter. The girl must have been around 16 years old, with a bulging stomach and an advanced state of pregnancy. The old man was furious at the sight of them and waved his knob kerry angrily as he accused them of raping his daughter. It took them half an hour to persuade the old man that it must have been some other soldiers and definitely not one of them. He gave them directions to a kraal where there would be enough food. They left him, convinced that it must have been one of the traitors working for the Boers responsible for his daughter's condition. From across the Mahangu fields they observed the kraal. It was obvious, according to local standards, that it was a rich man's property. There were several huts in the enclosure, some of them freshly thatched, and beyond the fields, several herds of cattle were visible. But it was high noon, and except for a few goats bleating in the distance, nothing stirred. After another 10 minutes, they approached the entrance to the kraal, and was merely a Y opening in the poles. They greeted loudly from the entrance, and after some considerable time, a man replied in Umbundu, and a little later he appeared. Upon seeing them, he appeared quite unhappy. Simon shifted the AK-47 as a warning and walked into the kraal, followed by Alfonso, who casually stepped a little to the side. It was common knowledge that the Umbundu tribe was supporters of the UNITA bandits. Not all of them though, but you never know. Simon's gaze travelled through the kraal. No traces of poverty on the ongoing war to be found here. Funny, he thought, as he stared hard at the man whose face now held a wary expression. "What do you want?" he asked nervously as he saw the expression on the faces of the gorillas. "I'm a poor man, minding my own business." "You live well," Simon spoke quietly. "You seem to live well, despite the war. I suppose you give generously to the fighters of our revolution when they pass here." "I live a little out of the way. The Swapo gorillas pass far to the east from here, but when they come, I always feed them." "I see," Simon said, and reached out and jerked away the buckskin covering the door of the hut. A frightened wail escaped the mouth of a young woman sitting huddled in one side of the hut. Simon took it all in a glance. The few boxes against the mud wall, the blankets on the floor, the form lying covered under the blanket, and downright fear on the face of the woman. The heel of a military boot was slightly visible under the blanket. He moved fast. In one fluent movement, he ripped away the blanket and stuck the muzzle of the AK-47 in the shocked face of a man dressed in the faded khaki clothes of a UNITA soldier. "Bandit!" he yelled. Outside, Alfonso fired a rapid burst, sending a stream of bullets across the kraal as the headman dropped to the ground, covering his head and screaming for mercy. The UNITA soldier lay numb with shock, surprised at being discovered. As he stared in the menacing muzzle, he saw the hatred in the eyes of the man behind it. The finger around the trigger was tense. He didn't move. At that moment, he hated himself for being so careless to leave his rifle in the hut next door. "Out!" Simon roared as he jerked the UNITA towards the door. He stepped backwards, but his eye didn't leave the bandit. Alfonso was crouching outside with the AK trained on the bandit, but his eyes and ears were wide open. Simon hit the bandit with the rifle butt, spinning him sprawling in the dusk, kicking his leg wide apart, with the UNITA spread-eagled on the ground. He kept the AK's muzzle against his head. "Search!" he ordered Alfonso. "There might be more of them." Alfonso quickly searched the kraal and returned moments later with the UNITA rifle, chest webbing and rucksack. "He's alone," he whispered, excited. "Only one set of prints in the kraal. There's some Boer rations at the cooking fires." He spun around. "Traitor!" he yelled and kicked the headman in the side. "You're an informant to the Boers, and your daughters are into funny business with the UNITA bandits. This is Angola, not Namibia." "Shut up. We and the Angolan government are comrades. Playing around with UNITA is asking for death." "Let's tie this bastard," Simon yelled, sweat dripping down his chin. "Mamba will have to ask this one a few questions." With the UNITA bound and gagged, they quickly round up the whole kraal and forced everyone face down on the ground, next to the distraught headman. There were 3 women and a baby. Simon licked his lips. He didn't anticipate all of this, but he was certain that Mamba would approve, especially the captured bandit, and Mamba would have punished the traitors. He glanced at Alfonso on the other side and saw him staring at the young woman who was in the hut with the bandit. He also noticed that she was young and pretty. "You!" he yelled and grabbed her by the arm. "Come!" "Leave her alone!" the UNITA shouted. Alfonso repeatedly slammed the butt of his rifle against the bandit's neck until he lay completely still. Simon dragged the wailing woman into the hut and flung her against the floor. Resting his AK against the door, he unbuttoned his fly and tore her skirt away and raped her. "That will teach you to stay away from the bandits," he told the crying woman when he had finished. Picking up his AK, he went outside. He mentioned to the grinning Alfonso, who didn't wait but went inside and started raping her as well. The other two women were crying softly with the baby yelling on top of its voice, but no one was moving. Lying dead still on the floor, they couldn't help but hear the sobbing women and Alfonso's panting inside. John van Zyl put the crosshair of the 7.62mm Mauser snipping rifle just above the ear of the terrorist and squeezed the trigger. Through the scope, he could see the head explode as the heavy caliber bullet hit the target. "Got him," he said softly, as he worked the bolt. From his vantage point behind the gigantic baobab tree, he could see people scattering in all directions. With the threat of the AK-47 removed, nothing could keep them on the ground. John could see one was still on the ground. Alfonso jerked upright at the explosive crack. "Ambush!" flashed through his mind as he leapt up from the stricken girl. With one hand clutching his pants, he missed his AK as he ran through the entrance of the hut. Instinct led him to the side of the Mahangu field, where he pulled himself over the pole enclosure of the kraal. Keeping under cover in the Mahangu, he ran as fast as he could. Once in the bush, he slowed a little to catch his breath. He had to be cautious not to run into enemy soldiers. It was only when he started climbing towards Mamba's hideaway that he thought about Simon. Simon was dead, his head blown away and still lying on the pool of blood in the kraal. Mamba is going to be furious. He hated failure and he hated disorderly behavior. The problem with all those who had trained in Cuba. After the original commotion had died down and only the lamented cries of the women could be heard, Tom cautiously approached the kraal. Although they had picked up the spoor of only two men, one could never be too careful. John's shot had killed one terrorist. The other would be gone by now. Still, he had to make sure there was no one left. He kept under cover and moved slowly. It was hot. Tom wiped the sweat from his forehead as he reached the kraal. He peeped through the pole fence. The terrorist still lay where he had been shot. Under the single tree in the kraal, the headman was pouring water over the UNITA soldier's head. There was no one else in sight, but he could hear the laments of women in a hut on the other side of the kraal. Tom had gone well into the kraal before he noticed. The sickening expression on the headman's face turned into one of utter delight when he recognized Tom. "Captain," he cried out and jumped to his feet. "Como está, amigo? How are you?" Tom inquired in Portuguese as they gripped hands. "What happened?" In a storm of words, the man explained the situation. He was looking grave and sick and then smiled jovially as he ended his tale. "And then you shot that man and saved us all." "I'm in debt, Captain, I'm in debt." "You saved my life twice now." Tom waved his hand. "You would have done the same, Roberto, if it was me. I'm glad no one was killed." "Who is this?" "The son of a good friend. He is one of Savimbi's commanders. They were on a reconnaissance mission east of here and came to visit last night. He is to leave again tonight. I gave him the pleasures of one of my newborn daughters, and the Swapus came without warning." The UNITA soldiers stirred and moaned. There was an ugly-looking lump on his head, and the wound was bleeding. Roberto looked concerned. "Captain, you can help?" Tom nodded. "Can you send someone to keep a lookout?" Robert called his eldest daughter and quickly dispatched her to some unknown vantage point, but Tom was satisfied. No one could now approach the kraal unnoticed. He summoned John on his VHF radio. When John arrived with the medical bag, Tom quickly stitched the wound and wrapped it with a field dressing. He gave the UNITA a shot of morphine to ease the pain. The soldier, who was wide awake now, stared at his every move with grateful eyes. John, you better break radio silence and contact base. Send a contact report through and ask for a pickup tonight. They must get in touch with Jeffrey and arrange for them to be extracted as well. I presume this was Mamba's men. By tomorrow it will be crawling around here, he added as an afterthought. It was an excellent shot, and that over a distance of 800 meters. John grinned. It was only his second mission with Tom's group, and a compliment from a man of his stature was more rewarding than anything else. Yet it was his first kill. Looking at the distorted head of the terrorist, he wanted to be ill. Instead, he concentrated on his task to establish radio contact with headquarters. It's been some time, Roberto. Tom spoke to the headman of the kraal. Ever since he had entered the war, Roberto had been an informant to the South African security forces, and his loyalties were with UNITA. How he had survived the Clan and MPLA soldiers for so long he could never fathom. But then Roberto had his own system of early warning and intelligence gathering that he was unwilling to share with anyone. His kraals had been buried down twice, but not once had he been caught. Every time he rebuilt, and this time he was almost caught. How come they surprised you here? Don't know, Captain. As far as we know, no one has entered the area since you cleared Zangongo. They all withdrew to Huambu and Kahama. They must have moved into the area during the last couple of days. Otherwise, I would have known. Tom nodded. Yes, I think so too. We picked up signs of Mamba and a group since Monday. He has left notes at all the waterholes to the north. That's why I came here, to find out what you know. They must be working pretty careful, avoiding the locals, and arrived here probably in search of food. They will be back, Robert nodded gravely. We shall go into hiding. They will find nothing. They talked for a while, and Tom noticed that the UNITA commander's attention never wavered. The gorilla was following every word. When he stood to leave, they gripped hands. Thank you, they said. We shall meet again. And Tom had that feeling too. Matthias led his body with painstaking care up to the mountainside, making use of the large boulders and trees to cover their approach. He was very close to the beacon before he saw it. With a soft grunt, he pointed it out to the youngster. Comrade Mamba will be 80 paces to the west of it, he whispered. Keep a sharp lookout. Mamba watched their approach and remained utterly still next to the fallen trunk. They almost walked past him before he spoke. Matthias, he grinned as he saw the surprise on their faces turned to delight. This way. He led them through the rocks to the hide. Alfonso and Simon went for food, but I brewed some coffee, real good Cuban coffee, he said, as the two dropped their packs against the rocks. So, how was the hunt? The Boers are here, all right. Matthias produced his tin cup and filled it with black coffee. He leaned back against the rock and wiped his face with his khaki bush hat. You found tracks? No. Matthias took a sip. They answered your notes. Without a word, Mamba took the note and unfolded it. Scribbled beneath his message was the answer. I urinated in the water. Tango Mike. He felt an instant flare of irritation. The note was supposed to intimidate the Boers, to throw them off balance and to force them to make mistakes, whereupon his men would have tracked them down and killed them. Instead, they ridiculed it. Dit is dan die voorlesing vir vanaand. Môre gaan ons weer aan met Destiny. Mooi aand. Dankie dat jy like, subscribe, share en die bel button druk.